All right, welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. On the Sundays, I am working on this four-function model, human model that I'm developing. And this is a particularly exciting day because I'm going to be talking about Carl Jung. So firstly, I want to just give you, all the limitations that I have. And I want to tell you about my approach to this, which is highly, I think, unusual approach. What I try to do is I've been running these meetups for 4 years. So essentially what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to come up with a simple framework so people have common vocabulary to talk about the human condition. So people who differ on positions, come from different theories, can have some kind of a common vocabulary. I found that when we studied Daniel Kahneman's work of System 1 and System 2, it was very powerful because it allowed people, once they have these concepts, to talk, so we could talk at a higher level and we could identify our differences, we could compare different theories. And I'm trying to extend that. So that's what I'm trying to do. Now, I have very, very severe limitations. So I have a certain kind of approach. So I want to make it very plain what my approach is. So firstly, what I'm trying to do is I'm not quote unquote a scholar. I don't believe in studying something very deeply. What I try to do is I try to go across many fields. So if I'm studying psychology, I will look at many different psychologists. I will also try to learn from sociology and anthropology and neuroscience and try to apply it. So in terms of kind of scholarly presentation on Jung, this is not it. Though I love Jung, my understanding of Jung, I mean, even in this meeting, there are many people who understand Jung much deeper than I do. So I don't claim to understand any particular topic that I'm talking about deeper. There are people who focus only on that topic. What I am trying to do is that I'm trying to look at Jung or any particular topic I'm looking at to see what kind of key general principles I can take away from it that are useful across the board, no matter what you're looking at. So that's what I'm trying to do. Second thing is that, so I'm not specialized, I'm kind of a generalist. I'm trying to bring together many different areas. Second, I'm trying to foster conversation. Whatever I'm presenting is half-baked, okay? It is half-baked in the sense that it means that I've formed it to some extent, but I am talking to people about it because I expect that I'll be able to form a better baked product over time by actually exposing what I'm doing, how I'm doing it, and getting feedback on it. So for example, on the meetup page, you saw the diagram. And I've done now 4 meetups on that using various versions of the diagram. And during every meetup, a number of people have commented on how they would do the diagram in order to achieve the same goals that I'm trying to achieve. There are 4 people like Pegor here, who's here, then Joe and Maritza and Carl. They created their own versions of diagrams which were different and sent them to me. So what I'm trying to do is that I'm trying to engage people in a conversation as I'm developing it. The second thing is that, this is something that I've been thinking about, mulling about for a long time. And when that happens, when you're trying to communicate, you take too many things for granted. And it's difficult to get the perspective of whether you're actually communicating objectively to anybody out there. And I find it very hard to do. So what I'm doing is that I'm saying it and then I'm hearing what people are saying very carefully and then trying to modify what I'm presenting. Like, for example, some of the words that I've used in the diagram, people said, I have different connotations and different associations with it. Somebody said that the way you have presented this diagram is how it's kind of historical, moving from like biology to civilization. But how do you actually use it? How do I use this to make decisions? So there are just amazing level of questions, and I'm using those to kind of make things on one hand simpler, and on the other hand trying to build more things into it. So I'm kind of thinking out aloud here. Okay, so given all the 4 meetups that I've done, experience with that, this time I'm going to go much simpler. What I'm trying to do, so firstly, I would request you to get a pen and a paper. Please get a pen and a paper, because instead of me drawing it, I think I'm going to have you draw some things, very simple things. But the beautiful thing about the visual representation is that you can see all the relationships in one glance. And that's the power of visual representation. So the plan for today is that I'm going to talk about the 2 axes, the vertical axis and the horizontal axis, using Carl Jung's ideas. And then I'm going to add some more ideas, which are other formulations of the same thing, or similar things. And then I'm going to take one idea of Carl Jung and show how concepts in one area can be used to throw light on another area. So that's what we're going to do. So first, I'm going to talk about Carl Jung's idea of subject and object. So introversion, introverted, and extraversion. And that's my vertical axis. This is about kind of internal versus external. But I think Carl Jung has a very powerful take on it, which I have found the most useful. So that's the vertical axis. So if you have, please have pen and paper. And the first axis we're going to draw and talk about is the vertical axis. And then we're going to talk about a horizontal axis. And there I'm going to have 3 different formulations, radically different formulations of the horizontal axis, okay? That's going to be the main part. If I can communicate the value of these 2 axes and how they help you understand the human condition, I think this would have been a good success. And what I'm presenting, again, I'm telling you that this is a work in progress. So I really appreciate all your comments. But we're going to do it in a structured way. So there are about, close to 50 people here. So we have to make sure that we do it in a structured way. But we do this every day. So that's just going to happen. All right. So that's a quick introduction to what I'm going to do. So let me first, first make sure you have pen and a paper ready. All right. So first axis you draw is a vertical axis. So just a vertical axis with arrows on both sides. Okay. So that's the first axis. And I'll call it the subject object axis. Okay. Now the best description of this. Now, firstly, this is a very age-old issue. Almost every philosopher has to deal with this. There is something out there which is outside of you, and then there is your experience of it. That's the distinction that we're trying to capture. Okay, so every philosopher has something to say about it. This is a very, this is a persistent philosophical concept. But I particularly like Carl Jung's take on this one. And the best presentation of that is done by, that I have found, is by Michael Pierce in his new book, Motes and Beams. So I'm going to read from that to make this idea clear. Now, what I will do is that I will have time for Q&As at various points, but the Q&A is going to be tightly focused on the particular point. So I'm going to tell you about this axis as I understand it, and as how I use it, and how I think Carl Jung uses it. And then I'm going to open it up to questions just on that. And then we will go to the horizontal axis, okay? The original meaning, so firstly, the way in which Jung formulated it, he formulated the concepts of introvert and he called it extrovert. But unfortunately, the way in which the common parlance in which it is used is very different. Introverted people say people who like to keep to themselves. Extrovert is somebody who is gregarious, who likes to go to parties. Then some of the people in the MBTI community talk about it as being whether you get energy from being by yourself or whether you get energy from being with other people. Okay. Jung's grasp of it is far deeper than that. So do not look at this description, because it's important to get, these are very simple concepts, but you have to get it exactly right for them to be very effective as general purpose tools for thinking about human condition. We're not just talking about a definition of a small term, we're talking about some fundamental aspect of human beings. That's what we're trying to get at. So the original meaning, so I'm just reading out from Michael's book here, which is the best, kind of most condensed description that I have seen of this. The original meaning of extraversion and introversion centers on differing attitudes towards the object, attitude to the object. Object is anything unidentified with the subject of experience, and their total meaning and their total mental apparatus, both conscious and unconscious. So there is your psyche, if you want, or there is your ability to experience, and then there is an object outside. So object is what is outside, and you have the capacity of experiencing the object. It is anything external, alien, or independent of the ego, identity, or the self. For in psychology, there must be an experiencer or a thinker, the subject, and the thing which is experienced or thought about, the object. Okay? When something is quote unquote subjective, it is internal to a person, i.e., what goes on inside their head, how they experience the world. But when something is objective, it is external to a person, i.e., that which takes place independent of their own mind, the world which they experience, etc. Okay, so this is the basic idea. Now, the beautiful thing about Carl Jung is how he looks at these concepts. This is a very simple concept, okay, but he has this further observation. The fate of one individual or some individuals is determined more by the objects of his interest, while in another, it is determined more by his own inner self, by the subject. One allows himself to be oriented by the given facts, and the other holds in reserve a view which interposes itself between him and objective data. Whereas the extrovert continuously appeals to what comes to him from the object, the introvert relies principally on what sense impressions constellate in the subject. Okay, so this is quotations from Carl Jung. Now, Michael Pierce has a very good commentary on this. He says, in other words, extraversion seeks to align its will with the information from the object, but the introversion seeks to align information received from objects with its own will, to abstract an idea from the object, and thus repurpose or reinterpret the information in reference to themselves. Extraversion privileges objective factors, while introversion privileges subjective factors. In short, orientation by the object versus orientation by the subject. He goes on, extraversion devalues the subject as something insulated from the world. Extraversion is uncomfortable with an idea until it is verified with objective data, that is, trans-subjective basis. The extraversion's ultimate tendency is the destruction of barriers between individual subjectivities and the complete dissolution of the subject into the realm that is commonly accessible, impersonal, the non-self, Introversion, on the other hand, devalues the object as an alien, unpredictable, and impertinent. Introversion is uncomfortable with anything it has not reconciled or checked with its own subjective material. Ultimately, everything is to become an expression of the subject and its worldview. Introversion's ultimate tendency is the assimilation or digestion of all objects, of all that is non-self into the self. Objective information is meaningless to it until some subjective experience or idea is found or created to correspond to it. Everything is translated into subject's term. Okay. Now there is one more very interesting point here. Okay. Um, so I want to put it first in my own terms. Both object and subject are integral part of our experience. It's one system. You can't really have one. Pure subjective dissociated with objectness is just craziness. Okay, and pure objective without assimilation of what it is, the patterns in it, is just dissociated concretes. Neither of them is sufficient for a human being. So it's a system. It's a system of subject and object. So both the ends of the axes, if you have drawn them, it's a system. Now, the way in which I think about introversion and extroversion is I see both of them as loops, starting at a point, going to the other point, and returning back. So somebody who is introverted has a very explicit, a very clear sense of who they are and what they think. They start from that, then they go out into the world to the object, glean different things from it, and then come back. So both the starting point and the ending point is in the subject for an introvert, but the middle point is outside. So it's a loop starting from yourself, going out into the world, and bringing back. What you're trying to do is that you're trying to enrich what is your subject. In case of a person who is extroverted, they are also running they're also running a loop, but that loop starts with the outside, then comes inside in the subject, and then goes outside again. So it starts with things. It starts to see what kind of impressions, patterns that they see of it. And then they have to translate them. They must translate them back into objective reality for the cycle to be complete. So both are running a loop that includes both subject and object. It's a question of where do you start, where do you end, and what is the middle point? Now, the way in which Michael Pierce puts it is, so far we have been considering extraversion and introversion as separate tendencies. But as with all true opposites, in practice, extraversion and introversion represent a cycle of motion. Extraversion in a given individual is itself a movement away from the state of introversion and vice versa. Let me read that again. Extraversion in a given individual is itself a movement away from the state of introversion and vice versa. The motion of extraversion is like having a sheltered country child entering metropolis, New York, and having every one of their personal beliefs challenged. So that's what the experience of the extroverted is, that they see the world as being enormously complex, and they're trying to adjust their mental mental objects to that, the subjective things to that. For the extrovert, it is an expansion from a sheltered dream to a cosmopolitan reality. The introvert in motion is like someone now long wearied by noise and bustle of the city, returning to their old country home to meditate in peace and quiet and rediscover what is really important. Just as water cycles between lake and cloud, so psychic energy cycles between introversion and extraversion. They are, in this sense, one, a spinning wheel, an eternal round. Okay, so that I think is one of the axes, the vertical axis. Now, what I want to do is that I want to open it up for questions. Now, we have 4 rules for this, which have worked really well for us. The first rule is raise your hand when you want to speak. You can raise your hand by typing an exclamation mark in chat or raising your hand in Zoom. Number 2, keep on topic. At a given time, we are discussing only something. So for example, now we are just discussing this distinction between subject and object, okay? Number 3, be brief. There are lots of people who have interesting things to say. We are trying to cover a lot of area in this meetup. So please be brief. And number 3, be courteous. Feel free to disagree with anything anybody says. Feel free to speak your mind, but do so courteously. First up is Jim. Jim, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wonder if you could give a concrete example of the loops, you know, give an example of a specific object and somebody's subjective experience of it, just to help.
Sure. So one example would be, I formulated this idea in my head. I've spent a lot of time on it. That is my primary thing that I'm really caring about. I'm speaking it out now, putting it out into the world, and I'm listening to what you're saying and what everybody is saying in order to make what my conception is richer. And this is how I experience it myself, that I'm trying to grow. And the way I'm growing is to put things out into the world, listen to what the other people are saying and what experience I have, and modify it with that.
So that sounds like the extroversion loop example.
No, that's because it starts with introvert. I have a vision of what I think captures everything. That's what I'm starting with. That's the core. That's the thing that is motivating me. That's the thing that I'm focused on. And then I'm going out into the reality to check it and come back. So it's a loop of that kind. Next up is Aiden, Marco, and Jackie. Aiden, go ahead.
Okay, gosh, I love that you're talking about extroversion versus introversion. This is a huge topic on my mind lately, and Shrikant, you'll love this. I drew this before you said your thing. I don't know if you could see it, but
give me just a second. I'm just going to move it. Yes, perfect. Yes.
So that's the extrovert versus introvert.
Exactly. Exactly.
So quickly, I'll just say, because it's funny, we're on the same page about this. For the introvert, the energy, so I think of it like this. It's a matter of a flow of energy, where energy comes from, and it's a matter of a flow of attention, where energy goes. So for an extrovert, they get energized by the external world of ideas and people and things. That's where the energy comes from, and that's where their attention goes. For the introvert, the energy comes from within. The subjective factor is what Jung calls it. The energy comes from the subjective factor, and the attention goes to the subjective factor. So what's interesting to add to all of this is 2 things I just want to say briefly.
Please.
One is the danger for the extrovert is losing touch with their relationship to themselves, because they're so organized against external reality. They lose track of with whom they're relating to external reality.
Yes.
And the danger for the introvert is to lose touch with external reality, because there's so much attention going inward to the inner ideas and the subjective factor. They can lose track of the external worlds that they live in.
Absolutely.
The other thing that's important to say is that, Jung would say everything exists because of the tension of opposites. And in all of the personality type material, right? So the attitudes and the functions. What he's really talking about is what we have a conscious relationship to. So when we say we're extroverted, we have a conscious relationship to our extroversion, which means inside of our unconscious is going to be a very introverted energy that we are not consciously related to.
Okay, Aiden, let's not go there yet because I want to go step by step. But
Okay.
Absolutely. I mean, we'll talk about that. I'm going to be talking about the concept of self, and so we'll go into that in detail. But Aiden, thank you very much. So feel free to talk at length because I know you know this field really well. So I'm glad to have you chime in. Next up is Marco, Jackie, and Shelly. Marco, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess maybe this will come up later, but I was thinking like, are there any like similarities between the introvert and extrovert?
Similarities. I mean, the thing is that both have both parts. It's just a question, as Aiden was putting it, it's a question of kind of emphasis, what gets, where do you start? Where do you end up? It's kind of, it's like, it's a cycle. It's a question of the starting points and the ending points. It's a question of what gives you energy, where your attention is naturally drawn, or all of that. So it's a perspective, and the way in which Carl Jung holds it is that he holds that just even in his functions, when he talks about introverted function, the guiding function for that is an extroverted function. And if you have an extroverted function, the guiding function for that is an introverted function. So you need both those things. It's just a question of what place. But we're going into a lot, I just want to talk about the axes, but we'll get to all these questions. It's a great question, but we'll get back to it. Next up is Jackie. Jackie, go ahead.
Thank you for this. Aiden kind of alluded to my question, but I wanted to hear your thoughts about it. I heard very clearly the extrovert's challenge. Everything is, and suffering almost, I would say. Everything is a challenge. The world is complex, quote unquote. I didn't hear you say anything specifically about the introvert. Aiden mentioned, his own words. I'd love to hear your take on that. Is there, quote unquote, suffering or deep challenges about that other than what Aiden mentioned? And the second piece is, are you talking about, when we go back and forth with this loop, integration, synthesis, these concepts? That's it.
Yes, I mean, the thing is that I'm getting the kind of this is excellent questions. Okay, excellent questions. I'm going to be focused on, I just want to lay out at this stage that there is the subject and there is the object. Okay, that's all in the axes. This loop, etc. I'm just giving a little bit of background of where Jung is coming from. But the core thing is that there is a subject, there is an internal thing that you have to focus on, and there is an external thing that you have to focus on. And both of those are critical. And depending on what your proclivities are, what you have, partly it is kind of you're born with, partly it is nurtured, partly it is chosen. It's kind of combination of all of that. You have some things that you're strong at, and you need the other part in order to kind of be completed. So for example, the challenge, you're asking about the challenge. So the two challenges that, this is Michael Pierce's take on it, is that just like, for the extrovert, it's a child going to New York. The other side of it is a New Yorker hungering for that peace of mind and trying to achieve the peace of mind, something like that. But let me continue. Let me see if there is anything ambivert is too complicated here. Do you visual example to share? Okay, all of these, I think we have put enough things on the table. I want to cover, because I'm going to do the second axis and then come back to this axis, and so we can look at it in tandem, because I want to introduce that other level of complexity. Okay, so let me start with that. Give me just a second. All right, the second part is going to be harder. Okay, The reason it's going to be harder is because I'm going to use several people's ideas for it. So I'm going to start with Carl Jung. And then I'm going to connect that to Daniel Kahneman's ideas. And then I'm going to connect it to the Chinese core idea of yin and yang. Okay. So that's what I want to, so I hope you're drawing. So please draw a horizontal axis with arrows on either side. Now, let me talk about, I think this is my favorite concept of Carl Jung, and that's the concept of self. Because, partly because of my Indian background, because this is very much deeply kind of Indian way of thinking. And I think Carl Jung has picked up a lot from India and has added his own insights to it. The point here, so first I'm just going to talk about Carl Jung's, as I understand it, his idea of the self. I think it's the most profound idea that I have seen from him. It is full acceptance of the fact that our psyche is very large, and that only small part of it you're conscious of. So your unconscious is very large, and a lot of the grandeur of being a human being is contained in the unconscious, is something that you're not necessarily not aware of. And the entire journey of individuation, what he calls individuation, is about making the unconscious more conscious. So bringing more and more of the unconscious into conscious and facing it. But the idea that, you have this psyche, most of it is unconscious. And that what you call consciousness, what you call your ego, what you call your I, is a relatively small spotlight that you have. It is limited in time of what it can be focused. It is limited in what it can be focused on at a given point of time. And so to be cognizant of your entire self, that it exists, and to relentlessly expand. So there is this dance going on between the conscious and the unconscious. That's one of the most profound concepts of Carl Jung. Okay, I'm not going to go into much detail of that because I want to look at the parallels between that and two other ways. So you can, in the horizontal axis, on one hand, so there are three different terms for each side. So first one on the left-hand side, you can put unconscious and conscious. So that's the terms of Carl Jung. The second thing I want to look at is the idea of Daniel Kahneman. Again, this is an older idea than Daniel Kahneman, but he's the one who has popularized it. And that's the concept of system 1 and system 2. System 1 is your automatic faculty, your faculty which is very fast. We've got a very large brain, and it can produce very complex reactions to things instantly. It is effortless, and it is charged with emotions and intuitions. So that is one, what he calls fast thinking. That's the system 1. And so that you can put it, put system 1 under unconscious. And then you have got system 2 under conscious. That is, system 2 is your ability to be deliberate, ability to apply standards, ability to look at objective data outside of your immediate here and now. Looking over a large space, which is not visible, and large frame of time, both future and present. This is slow. It is full of effort. It requires considerable act of will to do this. That is the second faculty. So you've got system 1 and system 2. That's another way. It's analogous to the unconscious and conscious. And the third way that I want to describe this horizontal axis, let me see how I'm doing on time. Okay. The third way I want to describe this, and this is a Chinese idea of yin and yang. Yin is the receptive, pliable, feminine quality, which flows very beautifully. And then yang is the active as opposed to reactive. It is effortful, forceful, strident, and that is the other side. So it's the yin and yang. So this horizontal axis, and to give you, I mean, the way I think about it is from the evolutionary perspective. In the evolution, this yin part comes first. It is life. It is very close to life, even before human beings. It is automatic. It is capable of doing a lot of things, especially with large brains like ours. Our system 1, we evolved in a group of about 30 to 50 people whom we knew all our lives in an environment that did not change that much. We are very, very good at interacting with one another. The communication through body language and facial expression that we do is amazingly effective. So even without words, a group of people who know each other really well and whose lives are tied together it made us the preeminent predator on the savannas. So that is the base, kind of time base. It has developed over 1 million years. Okay. The system 2, on the other hand, is relatively new. It is development of the prefrontal cortex here. It is, I think, and this is based on some anthropological research, it really kicked into a completely new gear, high gear, after the advent of cities, where you had to move from dealing with people that you know to dealing with people that you did not know. That you had to learn how to deal with people. See, before this, if you did not know somebody, they were enemy, and there would just be war. Whereas cities are based on how do you interact with people that you do not know, with whom you do not have commonalities of family and shared context. Another critical part in kind of turbocharging that, I think, is writing, because writing makes possible and this is idea of Julian Jaynes. He's written a book called, I think, Origins of Consciousness in Bicameral Mind. It's kind of like psychological anthropology. And I think his observation is the core observation that writing takes you to a new level is true, because it allows you to make your thinking, put your thinking down, externalize your thinking so that you can reflect on it, increasing its precision, comprehensiveness. And as you learn to do that over and over again, the extent to which you can deliberate, the range of space and time you can keep track of and act across keeps increasing. So I think there is a big distinction. So there is an evolutionary base and there is a civilization, evolutionary base for system 1, the left side of this axis, and then the kind of the modern context, only 4,000 or 5,000 year old, which really turbocharges. The faculty, the ability to do that is there in us before, which is used for things like coordination during hunting, etc. But the scale of its application and its power really develops fully with writing and civilization, things like that. So that's the second axis. So I want to now take questions about the first and the second axis. Tanya, I'm not deliberately not posting the diagram. What I'm having people do is I want you to draw your own diagram. So far, all we have is a vertical axis, which is the subject and object, and we have a horizontal axis. On left-hand side of that is system one, unconscious, and yin. And on the right-hand side of that, it is system two, conscious, and yang. So that's the simple thing. So any questions or comments about this? Laura, brief question, please.
Yeah, axes. I've drawn a third axis, not just two.
Okay, that's okay. I want to keep things simple. I will go from that. Okay, we can talk about this later. You have any questions about the two axes? We're just taking the questions about the two axes. So Jackie, you had a question.
Oh yeah, I just said I didn't hear you mention any loop concept for this axis. Did you? Are you
there is
that?
absolutely there is
Yeah.
a loop concept. You know, we have done kind of multiple meetups on different kinds of loops. To give you an example of that, would be so first example would be there is I have a friend who is a writer, and he uses so another way of looking at it is that it's this axis as applied to the subject. Okay, that's where kind of mostly system one, system two comes in. So it's kind of intuition versus analysis. So you can use loops very effectively to do that, to make the most of your intuition and analysis by using a loop. So I've done a full meetup on this. It's called intuitive analytical shuttling. The idea is that you set a purpose using your analytical mind about what you need to do. Then you brainstorm of what are the different kinds of, let's suppose you're writing a blog post, what kind of blog post would achieve your goals. Then you go back to the analytical mind and say, okay, which of them actually satisfy? The first one is a brainstorm from the intuitive side. Then you're using your analytical faculty to choose a thing. Then you're checking in with your intuitive faculty to see if you do actually want to write on that. Then you're going back to your analytical faculty to come up with a bullet points of where to start, where to end, and what to say in the middle. Then you're going back to the intuitive faculty, writing everything out. Then you're going back to the analytical faculty, trying to edit it down. Then you're coming back to the intuitive faculty to smoothen it out. And then you're doing the, going back and forth until you're satisfied. So this is an example of using a loop on a very large scale. Next one is al dente.
Hi, yeah, thanks. Appreciate it. I'm just wondering, it sounded like you were saying that maybe it was like a natural progression from the feeling sort of intuitive way of thinking towards a more deliberate analytical kind of way of thinking. And do you see that as continuing along as man progresses, as an evolutionary psychology kind of natural progression that we're going to continue along? And is there a limit to that? Do we at some point hit a limit that, that analytical will hit the ceiling and it bounces back and we have to revert to a more kind of feeling kind of thing? Okay,
that's a great question. I mean, the short answer is I don't know, because so first thing I would say is that we do not lose our evolutionary heritage when we move to the next level. Nothing in life does that. The older levels continue to support the higher levels, and higher levels kind of ride on the top of that. So another way of looking at it, the system two is a way of using your system one more effectively. So it's kind of the rider and the elephant. So they are kind of tied at the hip. Rider doesn't replace the elephant. he trains the elephant so things become more automatic. So it's all about acting at the system 2 level and pushing things down into system 1. So effective operation of system 1 is critical for system 2 to be freed up to keep on going to the next level and the next level and the next level after that. Now, where does this lead? I don't know for sure. I think what I expect is that but this is very, very speculative. I think people's capacity to use system 2 will keep going up. It's like a muscle, you have to keep doing that. And you create all kinds of supporting technologies in order to support that. So it allows you, so it's not only that you build things into system 1 directly, but you actually build things like the internet, for example, search engines, for example, in order to support your operating in that way. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to give the floor first to John and to Aiden. And you guys, each of you can spend up to 5 minutes to give your takes on whatever has been said. So John, you're first, go ahead.
There's a tremendous amount of space here. So I have some thoughts about Al Dente's question, so maybe I'll just say that first, is in terms of the specific word feeling, Jung always confused everybody with what he meant by feeling. Maybe that's a German thing, a high German, scholarly thing or something. Because by feeling, he specifically meant feeling was a rational function, and it specifically meant acknowledging formal relationships, to say it most simply. And feeling in the Jungian sense, with those terms of definitions, isn't directly involved with emotion. So of course in English common language usage, we say feeling for emotion all the time. And anyway, that's a distinction that's helpful when you talk about Jung. The other thing that comes into play, specifically with regards to your question, I think, is Srikrant is racing very fast and very far ahead here, because he's trying to cover all of space and all of time in as high level an overview as possible. Which is impossible, but it's admirable at the same time. You've got to try. So there's a tremendous amount of literature around study and philosophy of history, and it goes to exactly the point you made, that one of the more prominent ones that's still out there. There are a number of these. Arnold Toynbee was a historian who had one. Another historian who had one quite famously was Hegel. Where you have a culture, a civilization, a nation has a set of assumptions as a starting point. And then that starting point is the thesis. But immediately it generates an antithesis, and then they play out against each other. And then finally, if the civilization is going to succeed, it will come to some kind of an agreement or some kind of evolution that incorporates both. And so Jung, I can bring this up because Jung's thinking was in a lot of ways very Germanic and very formal, and in a lot of ways what he was doing was building on predecessors such as Hegel. So that's one thing to be said. Another thing, changing gears, is about introversion and extroversion. That, again, in common usage, it's common to talk about a person being an extrovert or an introvert. But I think the psychologists would avoid doing that. That extroversion and introversion are kind of concepts. And so that you never really have, so you never see extroversion or introversion directly. You only sense or somehow realize that there's a series of behaviors or a series of attitudes that suggest a preference for doing things one way rather than another. And so the other thing that comes forward here is that the psychologists, for the most part, yes, you have extroversion and introversion as being features. But then there are also the functions, the sensation, thinking, feeling, and intuition. And the psychologists, for the most part, prefer only to talk of them together, so that you talk about the attitude function in person, at least in terms of personal psychology. You talk about the attitude function. So you're specifically going to talk about introverted thinking, or you're specifically going to talk about extroverted feeling, and generally what that has to say. So these are some subtle colorations, I think, but I don't think these disagree or contradict what Srikrant is trying to do here. I think it just says that there are some nuanced ways of understanding how this can be useful in day-to-day life. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, John. Now the next one, Richard, are you still taking care of your kid, or are you ready to talk? Just let me know whenever you are. Right now I'm going to go to,
Hi.
Richard, go ahead.
Well, trying to put my video on. Hi,
Sure.
it's on my phone. I caught most of the first part of your talk, and then I went off to tell a good night story to my daughter. So I didn't hear the second part as much. It's a shame about the system 1 and system 2. Although it's interesting that that's concepts that I've sort of thought about and talked about myself as well. And actually, there's a video somewhere on YouTube. I think it's on YouTube from a few years ago at the BAP forum, where I did a thing about what is type and started bringing in those ideas as well. The subject-object thing's interesting because it comes back to dualism, essentially. You know, think what that concept, it's a subject-object dualism. It's an interesting area, you know, and that's where it is sitting in the dualist side rather than the monist side or anything else. Although I think it's more of a practical distinction in that it's just a fact that we can't access somebody else's subjective experience. And I think even now, you know, with the best brain scanning and so on, there's only a limited amount you can figure out of what someone's experiencing or what's going on inside them. It's still kind of that elusive realm of its own that we are sort of party to ourselves, but other people aren't. And therefore it's an important distinction. Although it's not strictly a true dualism, you know, in the sense that, because it all stems back to Descartes, doesn't it? You know, or even perhaps earlier, and the philosophy, you know, saying that, you know, essentially there's different, that the mind is some other substance than the object, the physical manifest world out there. And, you know, I think it's important that we're not going to that sort of distinction, I think. And I think you'd probably agree that it's not a true dualism, but it's a practical distinction that we have an internal experience that is not accessible to others, and that's just a fact. And I think it's important to see it on that level. But also, you know, I'm also into ideas like in consciousness studies. I don't know if you come across Max Velmans. Max Velmans is an English professor who writes a lot about consciousness and the philosophy of it. And his sort of work's got an idea called reflexive monism, which is summed up in a nutshell. It is the idea that there is only one reality. There is only one, you know, there is no duality. There is a monism. There is one reality. But this distinction that we have is that we are essentially, well, in a kind of poetic way, we are the universe realizing itself, or that kind of thing. You know, that sort of idea is reflexive monism, that this subject object, the fact, or the whole idea of a subject is that that is in itself a feedback loop in a singular reality. It's reality knowing itself. It's this kind of.
Let me ask you a question about, I know that you've studied the Chinese philosophy, the yin yang, those concepts. You've spent a lot of time looking at that and Jung. How do you see them? I see them as being intimately related to this, you know, kind of system one, system two. I look at them as kind of analogous way. How do you see them?
Well, he does talk about Chinese philosophy in psychological types. It's sort of somewhere around the middle of the book. There's a section where he gets into it. Now, you know, he's talking about introversion and extroversion as mechanisms. You know, I think that's the way he talks about them in the book.
Sorry.
In the sense that I think, and he sees the similarity. Can you still hear me? I'm not sure if
I think there is a problem with your audio.
Frozen a bit.
Okay, let's. Can you shut down your video so maybe your audio becomes better?
I'm not getting a good connection there.
Okay.
If you can still hear me.
Let's do one thing. Let's go to Aiden first, and then we'll come back to Richard. Aiden, go ahead. What are your comments?
Okay. Oh my gosh. This is wonderful, and I'm just simultaneously excited to be here and overwhelmed in terms of the vastness of material that we are covering in a short amount of time. I think what I want to share is that I love the way that you're conceptualizing this, Shrikant, and I think that you're doing it in a very Jungian fashion with that XY axis. It's a very quaternity type shape, which Jung has a lot of these. You read Eon and there's tons of ways of mapping things with these 4 directions, right? So that's like a very Jungian model. What I can add to the conversation is, you know, in terms of just quickly defining the other functions while we're here, Jung does it very briefly in an interview that I love.
Let's do one thing. Let's not go into the other function. I'm deliberately going slow because I'm kind of, this is part of what I'm trying to do here, Aiden, is I'm trying to keep it very, very simple. Saying, okay, there is subject object, there is kind of system 1, system 2. I want to make sure that people get this, and then I will do a follow-up on the functions where we go into detail, because I think what happens is that, you know, these kind of getting these concepts right is crucial, because it's very easy to kind of get so I'll go into, you know, details of each of these quadrants, but any short of that, please, any other comments, please?
Yes, let's see. So I think that what I would add is I can sort of make the point even without it, even if we use extroversion, introversion. I love what John said in terms of that it's not so much that it's this sort of static thing that we're introverts or extroverts. It's kind of the idea that we lean into one or the other as a preference at any given moment. And this is a very Jungian idea, right? So it's sort of the idea that that the movement in the personality is towards wholeness. So why I bring that up is because, yeah, it's hard actually to talk about this without the functions, but it's sort of like as we lean one direction, we lean away from the other direction. So very simply, even if we just use the map that you've made, right? As much as I lean into relationship with the object, to that extent, I lean away with relationship to self in that given moment.
Yes.
And similarly, as much as I lean into the system 2 or my conscious thinking, or my deliberate thinking, or the yang side of things, I lean away from the unconscious system 1 yin dimension. So this leaning factor is very important because it sort of says consciously at any given moment, I'm leaning a certain direction in terms of my reality, which means if I want to expand my perspective, if I want to experience more wholeness, to look where I'm leaning away from and to sit in that, to explore that consciously, deliberate individuation almost. I'm going to consciously explore the areas that I'm leaning away from in my life, because generally the areas we lean away from are the areas that we are unconscious of. And it brings up the whole idea of projection, which is another topic. But the idea is that we lean away from something that's part of our psychological reality, we will encounter it in the world in a movement towards wholeness automatically. So as much as we can be conscious of, in what way am I leaning? Am I leaning towards the object? Well, what's going on subjectively, right? If I'm leaning towards my subjective factor, well, what's going on in objective reality? And this is an intentional movement towards wholeness. So when you set it up like in a graph like this, it's really helpful because you can kind of locate yourself.
Yes. Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Aidan. Welcome, George. I'm glad to see you here. I would ask you to come in, but you've just come in. So let me go to Connors. Connors, go ahead. Connors, you need to unmute yourself. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry.
You have to speak. You have to speak into the mic. We can barely hear you. No, we can't hear you.
Hang on one moment. Okay, I think that worked. Did it work?
Works.
Can you hear me?
Go ahead. Yes, go ahead.
Oh, wow, that actually works. Sorry about that technical difficulty. So I'm very new to Carl Jung's ideas. I only started looking him up earlier this year because I started having a series of very, very vivid dreams, and I bought Psychology of the Unconscious Mind. So this stuff is very, very fresh for me. But so far what I'm looking up, I really like. I only have a question in terms of extroverted versus introverted. I do astrology on the side, reading for people, and I did look up a couple of takes on what Carl Jung thought about astrology from way back when. And there's this thing that I do when I'm reading people where I can see of like every certain amount of years, something about how they think versus how they feel will change. Do they go more based on things they say, or do they go more on their internal feelings more? Extroversion versus introversion. How often would that happen where people can switch between the two? Is it possible for people to have maybe both and then be conflicted with which one they tend to lean more towards based on their environment? Do they change it so often because of...
Excellent question. Let me go ahead and have Richard. Would you like to take that? Richard or George? Would you like to take that question? Do people change between the two?
Hi. So I'm back on a better connection. I mean, the level that Shrikant's been talking about introversion, extroversion, and that Jung talked about it, it's like a conceptual thing of how subject and object relate to each other in a sort of systems-based kind of view of things, like in the sense that we've got the subject is this part of the mind or the psyche that is engaging with something else, and then there's this engagement with it, and then we've got these two. There's a diagram that Marie-Louise von Franz did, which kind of describes it perfectly. You know, you've got the subject, you've got the object, and you've got an arrow going towards the object and an arrow going back towards the subject. And actually both of those are present. Like one of those arrows is introversion, one of them is extroversion. Like the outgoing attention and energy and so on towards the object is the extroversion. So that's the level which it is on a systems level. And we've got both of those within any engagement. There is a subjective experience of that engagement, and there is an experience of the actual thing itself that's being experienced.
Okay.
And that's the sort of level on which Jung engaged with introversion, extroversion primarily. And then you've got what's called an attitude in Jung's sense. And this is something I've written about recently, and Steve Myers, who's a Jungian scholar, he writes about this, that the word attitude is often like attributed to extroversion and introversion, as if extroversion and introversion are attitudes. His concept of attitude goes a lot further. And essentially, with there's attitudes between all kinds of different things, but the attitude means that you give a higher value to one over the other. So when you've got an introverted attitude, you give a higher value and preference to the subjective factor. You give to that arrow going towards the subject becomes the dominant one. When you've got an extroverted attitude, it's the opposite. The dominance is within the extroverted side of that mechanism.
Thank you, Richard. And Connor and anybody else, we did a 13-part series on Carl Jung, in which Richard, George, and John and others, many others participated. And if you go to 52 Living Ideas and look for the Carl Jung playlist, you'll find all the videos over there. Now, what I want to do is now I want to go and talk about one last idea of Carl Jung before we go to breakout rooms and then go to takeaways. So far, if you've been drawing, you will have those two axes. Now, I want to make just one point. So far, I've kept this only about the axes for now, but I want to make one point that these quadrants can give you insights on other quadrants. So one of the ideas I want to look at from Carl Jung is the idea of archetype. Okay, so what is an archetype? And I'm going to open this up. I think there are folks here who know this much better than I do, but the primary value I have found is that, see, archetype, this is something that Jordan Peterson also uses quite a bit. If you want to understand something about human beings, it is much more easier to think of parts of human beings as people and the role that they are playing in your psyche. So the idea of archetype is you take an idea like a hero or a father or a child or a spouse or somebody who completes you, is something like that, that you have basis for in that lower left corner, which is about objectives, so which is out there in reality, people that are out there in reality, which are in system one, part of your familiarity. And you take an idea from there and you apply it to your psyche. So that's the top left corner of your system one. That's a very powerful, so, Carl Jung uses this in terms of, there is a full presentation that Richard did on John Beebe's model of the 8-function model, where he combines the idea of archetypes with the ideas of psychological functions. That is there on our YouTube channel. But the basic idea here, I just want to focus on this one aspect of it, that archetypes, what is going on with archetypes? What is the power of this idea of archetypes? Is that you can observe the entire relationship between two people, the relationship between a parent and a child, which has so many things about it. And then you can carry it over from objective reality and apply it to your psyche, in your psyche. What would a loving parent, how would a loving parent guide you? Or what would be your attitude towards the child you love? So that is the basic idea of saying, okay, you can take something from one quadrant and apply it to another quadrant. So I just wanted to quickly go through that. Now, I want to open it up for general questions for a couple of, for a short time. And then I want to use breakout rooms. What breakout rooms do is that they allow you to discuss these ideas among yourself for about 25 minutes. And then you can come back here and share your takeaways. You can say what you got from this meetup, what questions remain. So that's what I would like to do. So if there are any kind of quick questions about archetypes, I will take them. Otherwise, we'll open up the breakout rooms. All right. We will go ahead. Wen, you're next.
I want to know the difference and how careful we are between the archetypes and stereotypes.
Okay. The archetypes, the way in which Jung approaches archetypes is that he has studied kind of multiple cultures and mythologies of many different cultures and tried to see patterns that emerge that remain true across cultures. And those are the archetypes. These are kind of patterns that we use to live. And that's what the purpose of archetypes is to identify deep, persistent patterns in human society and therefore human psyche. Stereotypes are, it's a negative thing where you're trying to quickly come up with a quote unquote model of a particular kinds of people in order to do that. So that's a very different kind of, and its purpose is different, and its method of operation is different. All right, let me see, is there a diagram I can see more clearly? So the diagrams are all there on the meetup page, or you can go to the blog. So go to 52livingideas.com and click on the blog to see the diagrams. I'm continuously producing new diagrams, and lots of people who are listening to these are producing their own diagrams. So I'm going to start posting all of them, and we'll keep on developing from there. All right, folks. Okay, George, can you say something about archetypes, please?
Well, I think I'm just going to read what I wrote in the chat. I mean, basically, the archetypes are unconscious dynamisms, and stereotypes are sociological phenomena.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I think that's all I have to say. Okay. I mean, there are implications there, but I think that's enough.
Wonderful, wonderful. All right, folks, so I'm starting the breakout rooms now.